The summer of 1939 was a crucible moment in world history, not only in Europe, where Nazi Germany prepared to unleash its war machine, but also in the vast grasslands of Mongolia, where Soviet and Japanese forces clashed in a battle that would reshape the entire Asian theater of the Second World War. This confrontation, known as the Battles of Khalkhin Gol, represented far more than a border skirmish between two expanding empires. It was the culmination of decades of Japanese imperial ambition, Mongolian vulnerability, and Soviet strategic calculation that would ultimately save Mongolia from Japanese occupation and fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War. To understand how the Soviet Union saved Mongolia from Japan, we must first understand what Mongolia was in the early 20th century and why it mattered so desperately to both Moscow and Tokyo. Mongolia had existed for centuries under Qing Chinese rule, a vast territory of steppes and deserts inhabited by nomadic peoples whose empire had once stretched from Korea to Hungary. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, Outer Mongolia declared its independence under the Bogd Khan, a Buddhist theocratic leader. This independence was fragile, contested by the new Chinese Republic, and threatened by various warlords and foreign powers who saw the sparsely populated territory as ripe for exploitation. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 changed everything for Mongolia. As civil war consumed Russia, Mongolia became a battleground for White Russian forces fleeing the Red Army. The most notorious of these was Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, a Baltic German officer who seized control of Mongolia's capital, Urga, in 1921 with a force of White Russian and Mongolian troops. Ungern-Sternberg's reign was brief and brutal, characterized by mass executions and an attempt to restore a pan-Mongolian empire under his personal rule. His presence in Mongolia gave the Bolsheviks the pretext they needed to intervene. In July 1921, the Red Army entered Mongolia alongside Mongolian revolutionary forces led by Damdin Sukbatar and Khorlugin Choibalsan. They defeated Ungern-Sternberg's forces and established the Mongolian People's Republic in November 1924, making Mongolia the world's second communist state after Soviet Russia. This was not merely ideological solidarity. Mongolia's geographic position made it strategically invaluable to Moscow. It served as a buffer between the Soviet Union and China, and more importantly, between the Soviet Union and Japan, which had already demonstrated its imperial ambitions by annexing Korea in 1910 and establishing significant influence in Manchuria. Japan's interest in Mongolia was part of a broader strategic vision that consumed Japanese military planning throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The Japanese Empire was resource poor, dependent on imports of oil, rubber, iron, and other materials necessary for industrial development and military expansion. Japanese strategic thinkers were divided into two camps regarding how to secure these resources. The Southern Expansion Doctrine advocated moving into Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, seizing the resource-rich colonies of European powers. The Northern Expansion Doctrine, favored by the Imperial Japanese Army, called for expansion into Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China, where vast mineral wealth and living space could be seized from the Soviet Union and China. The Japanese Army had already tasted success with its seizure of Manchuria in 1931. Following a staged incident at Mukden, Japanese forces rapidly overran the entire region, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932, with the last Qing emperor, Puyi, as its nominal head. Manchukuo gave Japan a massive territorial base on the Asian mainland, rich in coal, iron, and agricultural land. But for the most aggressive officers in the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force stationed in Manchukuo, this was only the beginning. Mongolia beckoned as the next logical target. From the Japanese perspective, Mongolia offered several strategic advantages. Its conquest would eliminate the Soviet buffer state and bring Japanese forces directly to the Soviet border, threatening the vital Trans-Siberian Railway and the Soviet Far East. Mongolia's grasslands could support Japanese agricultural colonization. Perhaps most importantly, seizing Mongolia would be a stepping stone to further expansion into Soviet Siberia, where unimaginable resources awaited. The Kwantung army officers, emboldened by their easy victory in Manchuria and operating with significant autonomy from Tokyo, began probing Mongolian and Soviet defenses throughout the mid-1930s. These probes escalated into serious armed conflicts. In 1935, Japanese and Manchukuo forces clashed with Mongolian and Soviet troops along the border in several incidents. The most significant early confrontation came in 1936 at Lake Khasan, where Soviet and Japanese forces fought a brief but intense battle that resulted in approximately 1,500 casualties. The Japanese tested Soviet resolve again in 1938 at the Battle of Lake Khasan, a larger engagement involving tens of thousands of troops on both sides. The Soviets, under the command of Marshal Vasily Blyucher, repelled the Japanese assault after 2 weeks of fighting that cost over 2,500 casualties. These battles were warnings of what was to come. The border between Manchukuo and Mongolia was poorly defined, a fact that both sides exploited. The Japanese and their Manchukuo allies claimed the border ran along the Khalkhin-Gol River in eastern Mongolia. The Soviets and Mongolians insisted the border lay some 20 kilometers to the east. This disputed territory became the flashpoint for the largest battle of the undeclared Soviet-Japanese War. In May 1939, Mongolian cavalry units crossed into the disputed territory near the village of Nomonhan. Manchukuo forces engaged them, and the skirmish rapidly escalated. The Japanese Kwantung Army, seeing an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to Soviet and Mongolian forces and perhaps trigger a wider war that would allow the conquest of Mongolia, committed significant resources to the engagement. By mid-May, Japanese forces had pushed Mongolian units back across the Khalkhin-Gol River. This was the moment when the Soviet Union faced a critical decision. Moscow could accept the Japanese advance and effectively abandon Mongolia to its fate, or it could honor its mutual defense treaty with Mongolia and risk a major war with Japan at the worst possible moment. In Europe, Nazi Germany was making increasingly aggressive moves. Hitler had already annexed Austria and dismembered Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union faced the nightmare scenario of a two-front war against Germany in the west and Japan in the east. Stalin made his choice. The Soviet Union would defend Mongolia with overwhelming force. To command this operation, Stalin selected General Zhukov, then a relatively unknown corps commander who had distinguished himself in cavalry operations. Zhukov's appointment would prove to be one of Stalin's most consequential decisions. The future Marshal of the Soviet Union arrived in Mongolia in June 1939 with orders to not merely repel the Japanese, but to destroy their forces so completely that Japan would never again consider northern expansion a viable strategy. Zhukov immediately began assembling a formidable force. Despite the remote location and primitive infrastructure, the Soviets poured men and materiel into Mongolia at an astonishing rate. By August, Zhukov commanded approximately 57,000 troops, 498 tanks, 385 armored cars, 542 artillery pieces, and 515 aircraft. This was a combined arms force of unprecedented sophistication in the region, supported by a logistics operation that stretched across thousands of kilometers of steppe and desert. The Soviets established a 750-kilometer supply line from the Trans-Siberian Railway to the battlefield, moving thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel and supplies across terrain with virtually no roads. The Japanese forces, commanded by Lieutenant General Michitaro Komatsubara, numbered approximately 75,000 troops with substantial artillery and air support, but far fewer tanks and armored vehicles. The Japanese army in 1939 was primarily an infantry force, optimized for fighting in the mountains and cities of China. Its tanks were light, thinly armored vehicles designed for infantry support, not the kind of armor warfare Zhukov was planning. Moreover, Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive spirit and infantry assault, with less attention paid to combined arms coordination and defensive preparation. Throughout June and July, both sides reinforced their positions and engaged in fierce but inconclusive fighting. The Japanese launched several major assaults, attempting to encircle and destroy Soviet and Mongolian forces west of the Khalkhin-Gol River. Soviet forces counterattacked repeatedly, with mixed results. The fighting was brutal, characterized by close-quarters combat, massive artillery barrages, and increasingly large tank battles. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but neither achieved a decisive advantage. Zhukov was not interested in a stalemate. He was planning something far more ambitious, a massive double envelopment that would encircle and annihilate the entire Japanese force. This required meticulous preparation and absolute secrecy. Throughout late July and early August, Zhukov quietly moved his armor and mechanized units into position, concealing them from Japanese aerial reconnaissance. He established false radio traffic to deceive Japanese intelligence. He stockpiled ammunition and fuel, and he waited for the perfect moment. That moment came on August 20th, 1939. At 0545 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire along the entire front in a devastating barrage that lasted 2 hours and 45 minutes. Then Zhukov's armor struck. Soviet tank brigades, supported by motorized infantry and aircraft, smashed into the Japanese flanks from both north and south. The Japanese, caught completely by surprise, found themselves facing a form of warfare for which they were utterly unprepared. Soviet BT-7 and T-26 tanks, operating in mass formations with close air support, tore through Japanese defensive positions. The Japanese fought with characteristic ferocity and courage, but courage alone could not stop massed armor and artillery. Within 3 days, Soviet forces had completed the encirclement, trapping the bulk of the Japanese 23rd Division and other units in a pocket west of the Khalkhin-Gol River. Japanese attempts to break out were met with overwhelming firepower. Soviet aircraft dominated the skies, bombing and strafing Japanese positions with near impunity. Soviet artillery pounded the pocket continuously, and Soviet armor and infantry systematically compressed the perimeter, destroying Japanese units piecemeal. The Japanese Kwantung Army attempted to relieve the encircled forces, launching desperate counterattacks that achieved nothing but additional casualties. By August 31st, organized Japanese resistance had effectively ceased. The Battle of Khalkhin-Gol was over, and it was a catastrophic Japanese defeat. Soviet and Mongolian casualties were significant, approximately 9,000 killed and 16,000 wounded. But Japanese casualties were devastating. At least 18,000 killed, over 20,000 wounded, and hundreds captured. Entire Japanese units had been annihilated. The 23rd Division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The strategic consequences of Khalkhin-Gol were profound and immediate. For Japan, the battle represented an unmitigated disaster that fundamentally reshaped imperial strategy. The dream of northern expansion lay shattered on the Mongolian steppe. The Japanese army had been humiliated by Soviet forces using tactics and technology that exposed the profound weaknesses in Japanese doctrine and equipment. The myth of Japanese invincibility carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, had been destroyed. Within the Japanese High Command, the defeat at Khalkhin Gol decisively shifted strategic thinking away from the Northern Expansion Doctrine and toward the Southern Expansion Doctrine. If Japan could not defeat the Soviets in Mongolia, then Siberia was out of reach. The resources Japan needed would have to be seized from European colonies in Southeast Asia. This strategic reorientation led directly to Japanese expansion into French Indochina in 1940, the decision to strike south toward the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, and ultimately the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Equally important was what Japan chose not to do. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Japan faced intense pressure from Berlin to open a second front in the east. Hitler desperately wanted Japanese forces attacking Siberia, which would force Stalin to fight a two-front war and potentially collapse the Soviet Union. But Japan remembered Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese High Command had no appetite for another confrontation with Soviet forces. Instead, Japan maintained the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact signed in April 1941, allowing Stalin to transfer critical divisions from the Far East to the defense of Moscow in late 1941. These Siberian divisions, battle-hardened and equipped for winter warfare, played a crucial role in stopping the German advance and launching the Soviet counteroffensive that saved Moscow. Without exaggeration, the Soviet victory at Khalkhin Gol helped save not only Mongolia, but potentially the entire Soviet Union. If Japan had attacked Siberia in 1941, while Germany was advancing on Moscow, Stalin would have faced the nightmare two-front war that might have led to Soviet defeat. The Red Army divisions that stopped the Germans at Moscow would have been pinned down in the Far East. The industrial facilities evacuated from European Russia to Siberia and Central Asia would have been threatened or lost. The entire course of the Second World War might have been different. For Mongolia, the Soviet victory ensured its survival as an independent state. Had Japan succeeded at Khalkhin Gol, Mongolia would have been occupied, its people subjected to the brutal colonial regime Japan imposed on conquered territories. The Mongolian People's Republic would have ceased to exist, replaced by a Japanese puppet state or direct annexation. Instead, Mongolia remained firmly within the Soviet sphere, maintaining its independence throughout the Cold War era. The battle also established General Zhukov as the Soviet Union's premier military commander. His successful use of combined arms warfare, operational deception, and encirclement tactics at Khalkhin Gol became templates for Soviet operations throughout the Great Patriotic War. When Germany invaded in 1941, Stalin repeatedly turned to Zhukov for the most critical missions, organizing the defense of Leningrad, commanding the defense of Moscow, planning the encirclement at Stalingrad, and ultimately leading the final assault on Berlin. The marshal who saved Mongolia in 1939 would go on to save the Soviet Union itself. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol also revealed important lessons about military technology and doctrine that both sides learned, though with varying degrees of success. The Soviets demonstrated the effectiveness of massed armor operating with air support and motorized infantry, validating the theories of deep operations developed by Soviet military theorists in the 1930s. The Japanese learned the hard way that their light tanks and infantry-centric doctrine were inadequate against modern mechanized forces. Unfortunately for Japan, these lessons came too late to fundamentally reform the Imperial Army before it faced American forces in the Pacific. The battle has been largely forgotten in Western historical memory, overshadowed by the outbreak of World War II in Europe just days after the fighting ended. On September 1, 1939, as Japanese and Soviet forces were still engaged in final skirmishes at Khalkhin Gol, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The world's attention turned to Europe, and the largest battle yet fought between mechanized forces became a footnote in most Western accounts of the period. But in Soviet, Mongolian, Japanese, and Asian military history, Khalkhin Gol occupies a central place as the battle that determined the fate of Northeast Asia. For Mongolia specifically, the battle cemented a relationship with the Soviet Union that would last for half a century. Mongolia became one of the most loyal Soviet satellite states, providing military bases, economic resources, and unfailing political support to Moscow throughout the Cold War. Soviet military forces remained stationed in Mongolia until 1992, a year after the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The Mongolian economy was integrated into the Soviet system, with Soviet advisors directing everything from industrial development to cultural policy. An entire generation of Mongolians was educated in Soviet universities, spoke Russian as a second language, and absorbed Soviet ideology and culture. This relationship had profound effects on Mongolian development. On one hand, Soviet support brought modernization, industrialization, education, and healthcare to a country that had been one of the poorest and most isolated in the world. Literacy rates soared, cities grew, infrastructure was built, life expectancy increased dramatically. On the other hand, Mongolia lost much of its independence and traditional culture. Soviet-style collectivization destroyed the nomadic pastoral economy. Buddhist monasteries were closed, and monks persecuted during Stalinist purges that mirrored those in the Soviet Union. Mongolian culture was subordinated to Soviet norms and Russian language. The legacy of Khalkhin Gol and Soviet-Mongolian relations remains visible in Mongolia today. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Mongolia transitioned to democracy and a market economy, but the historical memory of Soviet assistance against Japan remains strong. Mongolia maintains friendly relations with Russia, even as it has also developed close ties with the United States, Japan, and other nations as part of its third neighbor policy designed to balance between its two giant neighbors, Russia and China. The battle itself is commemorated in Mongolia as a defining moment of national survival, with monuments, museums, and annual commemorations keeping the memory alive. For Russia, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol represents an important but often overlooked chapter in Soviet military history. It was a preview of the Great Patriotic War, demonstrating both the Red Army's capability for sophisticated operations and the effectiveness of the military reforms and modernization programs of the 1930s. It was also one of the few unambiguous Soviet victories of the Stalin era that was not later tainted by revelations of massive casualties or strategic blunders. Zhukov's triumph in Mongolia remains a point of pride in Russian military tradition. For Japan, Khalkhin Gol is remembered as a painful defeat that exposed the limitations of the Imperial Army and contributed to the strategic decisions that led to the Pacific War. Japanese historians and military analysts have studied the battle extensively, recognizing it as a turning point that ended Japan's ambitions on the Asian mainland and redirected imperial expansion southward, ultimately leading to confrontation with the United States and Japan's catastrophic defeat in 1945. The broader lesson of Khalkhin Gol extends beyond the specific circumstances of 1939. It demonstrates how relatively small conflicts in seemingly peripheral regions can have enormous strategic consequences. A border dispute over a stretch of grassland in Mongolia determined whether Japan would attack the Soviet Union or the United States, which in turn shaped the entire course of World War II. It shows how military effectiveness depends not just on courage or numbers, but on doctrine, technology, training, and leadership. And it illustrates how great powers use smaller nations as buffers and battlegrounds in their own strategic competitions. with those smaller nations' survival depending on the protection of powerful patrons. Mongolia's fate in 1939 was decided not primarily by Mongolians, but by the Soviet Union's willingness to commit massive resources to defend its buffer state against Japanese expansion. That decision saved Mongolia from Japanese occupation and ensured its survival as an independent nation, albeit one firmly within the Soviet orbit for the next 5 decades. The cost was high for all involved, measured in thousands of lives lost on the steppe, and in the decades of Soviet domination that followed. But the alternative, Japanese occupation and colonization, would almost certainly have been worse, given Japan's brutal record in Korea, Manchuria, and China. Today, as great power competition once again intensifies in Asia, with Russia, China, and the United States maneuvering for influence and advantage, the lessons of Khalkhin Gol remain relevant. Small nations still find themselves caught between larger powers, their independence and security dependent on strategic calculations made in distant capitals. Border disputes still carry the potential to escalate into major conflicts, and military power, properly applied, still determines outcomes when diplomacy fails. The summer of 1939 in Mongolia reminds us that the fate of nations can be decided in remote places by battles most of the world never hears about, and that those decisions echo through generations, shaping the world we inhabit today.